Hi, my name is Morgan and I am a neuroscience researcher, and last week I made some people very angry because I said that I was a feminist, and to those people I just want to say welcome to a video talking about women in neuroscience. For this video I even wore my very special STEMinist shirt. Super love it, super happy with it. Go check out, there's a bajillion on Etsy and Amazon and places like that. Highly recommend. So why are we talking about the history of women in neuroscience today? There's a few reasons. First of all, I've been getting a lot of hate comments from people who think that sexism isn't real, or that feminism is bad, or that there's enough women in neuroscience, or because I'm a woman in neuroscience, somehow that's bad. So we just need to talk about this. Also, this month is Women's History Month, so therefore women's history in neuroscience seems applicable. Women's History Month has been a thing since 1955, and I'm very upset that this is the first year that I'm hearing about it, and I think that fact alone shows why we still need feminism. Now, I already see it before I get all of these comments about, well, why isn't there a Men's History Month? I just want you to take a second to think about every holiday that we traditionally celebrate in America and think about how 99% of them center around a dude. We get an entire day off of work or school for Columbus Day, and the most impressive thing that man did was get lost. So I think we can take a month to talk about women, and considering this has been a thing since 1955, and I'm just now hearing about it as a woman and a hardcore feminist, I think we haven't even been doing that for the past however many years that is. To help make this video a little bit more positive and to counteract all of the hate comments that I already know I'm going to receive, leave a comment below of a woman who has significantly influenced your life, or a female mentor that you've had, or someone who encouraged you to stay in science as a woman, anything like that. Leave some positive comments, some love for those people below. I will be reading all of them. Now, before I fully get into this video, I would like to shout out my social media real fast. Check out all of my social medias, I'll list them here, but most importantly, my Instagram. I've been using my Instagram for these past few videos to get video suggestions. So, for example, I put up a poll last week and people chose the Big Bang Theory, so that's why I reacted to that last week. And this week I put a poll asking if I should talk about some women's history, and everyone said yes. So go check it out if you want to get a say in what I'm putting out each week. Also, before I get into the history, people in history and even nowadays have some names that are very difficult for me to pronounce. I am so sorry about that. I'm bad with names everywhere, even very traditionally American names are very difficult for me. So this is not me mispronouncing anyone's name on purpose or anything. I just genuinely cannot pronounce them. If anyone wants to correct me in the comments, please feel free to. So like I said at the beginning of this video, this week we're talking about women's history in neuroscience. So I'm going to be talking about some famous women who have really progressed neuroscience forwards. Just to give a little bit of a layout of what this video is going to be, at first I'm going to talk about some basic history of women and women's education, and then I'll get into some famous examples. And by no means am I going to talk about every single woman who significantly influenced neuroscience, because that would be so many, and women traditionally in all fields have been sort of excluded from the narrative and typically erased whenever we've participated in something. So it's actually really difficult to find examples, not necessarily because women weren't there or weren't doing science, but because men would hide or take credit for their work. And so we're still uncovering people who have helped with major discoveries today. So like I said, women have been traditionally and historically excluded from education, and one could argue that we still are today. People with non-white and non-masculine sounding names are less likely to get most of the advantages that white males are afforded in today's society. And that's just a fact. You can look at the statistics on that. If you put in an application for a scholarship, if it's not a specifically women's scholarship, someone with a white masculine sounding name is more likely to get it than you if you have a feminine sounding or a person of color-ish sounding name. The reason for this bias against women in education is deeply ingrained throughout history. It started millions of years ago, basically since the day that women have existed. And whenever I'm talking about this, I'm talking about this mostly from a Western perspective. So I do know that there are some cultures where women were respected as equal to men, and then the West came in and changed that. So I acknowledge that, but that's not the history that I'm familiar with, so I don't really feel comfortable speaking on that. A lot of this bias against women is sort of just rooted in the fact that women bear children. And so people have used that for centuries to keep us out of education, saying that if we focus on our education, we won't have children, which, to be fair, educated women tend to have less children than uneducated women. But that's not a bad thing, and that's not a reason to keep us out of education. Some people have also argued that women have different brain structures than men, and therefore we cannot handle the same information that men can handle, which is just wrong. Brain structure studies are extremely complicated, and their findings are always sort of very dependent on their sample size, so it's hard to get like hardcore evidence from those. And also brain size doesn't necessarily correlate to intelligence. One of the most famous examples is that Albert Einstein actually had like a freakishly small brain. So there's nothing to that statement. Even Charles Darwin believed that women were less capable of being educated than men, that we were just naturally less intelligent, and he thought it had something to do with inheritance, so that you couldn't inherit, and that a woman couldn't inherit the intelligence of her father, and therefore women would never be able to be as intelligent as men, which is simply not how intelligence works. It's not necessarily inherited. It's much more a situation of circumstance. If your parents were more educated, they can likely afford you a better education, and therefore you will be more highly educated. It more flows like that. People have also argued throughout history and still today that the small amount of women who have won things like the Nobel Prize or who have been widely regarded for their science just shows that women aren't as capable in science as men, which is just inherently wrong, because if you think about it, if a group of people are excluded from studying something for the majority of history, how are we supposed to have contributed as much as men? And also there is a long tradition of men stealing women's works and winning prizes for that. One really famous example that comes to mind is Rosalind Franklin. She was involved in figuring out the double helical structure of DNA. Some people have even argued, and I personally believe, that she was the one who discovered the structure, and then she shared her discovery with Watson and Crick, who then received the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA, which Rosalind Franklin did and was never awarded the Nobel Prize for. And Rosalind Franklin is not the only woman that this has happened to. This is just the example that I know the best. There are many other documented cases of this, and judging by the history of this, I would say probably even more than we actually know about. In more recent history, there have been attempts to get women more involved in science. There are a lot of initiatives to get women more involved in science, and a lot of attempts, such as even like my channel is here to show representation of women in science, and just that representation alone can have a huge impact. There are also a lot of attempts to retain women in science. There have been a lot of studies that show that women mentoring other women can increase the retention of women in science. And personally, I don't believe that there's a lack of female interest in science, but it's more of a lack of accessibility. From personal account and from talking to other women, whenever we try to get interested in science, there is a lot of backlash from people due to their biases, either saying that it'll prevent us from having children or it'll make us wait to have children, which could be your main priority in life, but it should not be assumed that a woman's main priority in life is to have children. Personally, my main goal in life is to get a higher education, make discoveries in neuroscience, and be a good neuroscientist. That's my goal. It has nothing to do with children. Or there are still people with those deeply held beliefs that women are just incapable of being as intelligent as men, which is just wrong. So despite all of these initiatives to get women more involved in science, there's still the facts that people with female-sounding names and people who are female-presenting get less funding. They author significantly fewer papers as first or last author. And if you're not familiar with the hierarchy of authoring papers, the first author is the person who contributed the most to the paper, and the last author is the person whose lab most of the research was done in. So even if a woman was to do the majority of the work on the paper, she is still less likely to be credited as first author than her male colleagues who may have done less work than her. Women are awarded significantly fewer prizes for their work compared to their male colleagues. Between 1901 and 2019, only 21 of the 615 people awarded a Nobel Prize were women. And like I said earlier, there's a long history of men stealing women's works and presenting as their own and then being awarded prizes. So the likelihood that there were only 21 women who contributed to the things that were awarded Nobel Prizes is very low. Women also appear significantly less frequently than men as speakers at seminars or at conferences. Lastly, women are extremely underrepresented in the literature. We are understudied to a point that I consider it a crisis. Like, I think we're not studied medically as much as men are. Men are considered the standard, and there's a long list of examples where female physiology causes our presentation of different illnesses and different diseases to differ from men, and that goes underdiagnosed in us because we present differently. Women with autism present differently than men with autism, which leads to the extreme underdiagnosis of women, which also the biases of just the thought that women can't get autism, which is partially due to the fact that they are understudied. It also took us a ridiculously long time to figure out that women experience heart attacks differently than men, and I cannot think of the amount of women who probably die due to the amount of just doctors not being informed that women experience heart attacks differently. Something that my own research is seeking to set straight is that women experience anxiety and depression differently than men, and that is extremely understudied. So the point of going over this history and all of that statistical data is just the fact that it's very important that we're still having these conversations about having women in science. The thought that half of the population doesn't have proper access to education or doesn't have the same opportunities as the other half is just wrong, because it's not based on anything that's real. It's just based on our biases and on sexism. So partially just to point out that women have always been around and always been a part of neuroscience and scientific discoveries, and also partially to celebrate my own gender because we are not acknowledged as often as men are. Let's talk about some women who have progressed the field of neuroscience. I'm going to attempt to go through these in a chronological order, but also some of them may be sort of out of order. I'm going chronologically by their date of birth and not necessarily by their discoveries. The earliest that we can really see the impact of women on neuroscience starts in the 1900s. There are different theories as to why this is. The biggest one is access to education and our ability to study science without getting killed for being witches. But also it could just be that that's whenever we started, or it could be that people were just taking credit for women's work and we haven't uncovered the evidence otherwise. So the first person I'm going to talk about is Maria Manicea. She was one of the first women to graduate with a medical degree in Europe, and she is considered the founder of sleep research. She discovered that the negative effects of sleep originate in your brain, which was revolutionary at the time, and demonstrated that sleep is just as important to food and water in preserving life. She published the first comprehensive book on sleep in 1889, and it was considered the main text regarding it for a long time. In her book, she said that sleep was a particular state of activity of the brain and not necessarily the brain just being inactive, which was absolutely revolutionary at the time. People then just thought that your brain turns off whenever you go to sleep, and she showed that no, your brain is still active, it's just a different kind of activity. Next, there was a woman named Augusta Dergerian Klump. Hope I'm saying that right, but I doubt that I am. She was the first person to characterize and accurately describe a certain type of palsy, which then became now named after her as Klump's palsy. And she made this discovery whenever she was only 26 years old. So don't come at me telling me that women aren't capable of the same intelligence of men wherever she was able to do this at 26. She also worked closely with her husband and wrote the book Anatomy of the Central Nervous System, which became one of the most significant works in the field of neurology for a long time. Next, let's talk about Cecilia Barked. she was one of the first women to be admitted into medical school in Paris. Eventually, she went on to become the head of the anatomy department at Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Brain Research in Berlin. Her main focus was on the morphology of the nervous system, and her research contributed to our current understanding of the interactions between different regions of the brain. She was also one of the first scientists to use cortical electrical stimulation. Both she and her husband are regarded as key figures in the founding of modern neuroscience research. She and her husband established the Celia and Augusta Institute for Brain Research, which has one of the largest collections of brain samples in the entire world. She spent her whole life fighting the notion that women are not as intelligent as men, and way back in the 1920s said that her research did not support the idea that women and men have that different of brains. She also taught this to her daughters, and her daughters went on to have extremely successful scientific careers. One of her daughters became a psychiatrist, one a neuropharmacologist, and the last one a cancer biologist. And just to sprinkle some sexism into this extremely feminist story, one of her daughters went on to essentially found the field of molecular virology, along with a man named Del Bucco. And one of them was awarded the Nobel Prize and neglected to mention the other in their acceptance speech, even though they cited the other's work many times throughout their talk. And I bet you can't guess which one of them was given the Nobel Prize. Hint, it was the man. Rita Levi-Montley worked on neuronal growth factors, and she won the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1986 and was only the fourth woman to be awarded a Nobel Prize. Suzanne Corcoran was a professor of cognitive sciences at MIT, and she was famous for her work with patient HM. If you don't know who HM is, I have a video on anterograde amnesia. I'll link it somewhere up here. And essentially, he was a key case in discovering how anterograde amnesia works and how the formation of long-term memory works. What I thought was really interesting about this case in particular is that everyone in the field of neuroscience knows who patient HM is, but he was the patient. I have no clue who any of the neuroscientists who worked on him were. I just knew of the patient, but I can't tell you any of the people who worked on him before researching this video. But then through researching this video, I found that a lot of the people who worked on his case were women. I can't help but to think that might be part of the reason why I don't know any of their names. But Suzanne Corcoran's work with patient HM and also her animal models led to the discovery of how memory consolidation works in the hippocampus. Marion Cleves Diamond was a researcher at the University of California at Berkeley, and she is considered one of the founders of modern neuroscience. She was one of the neuroscientists who got to study Albert Einstein's brain and was a key figure in discovering that someone's surroundings and the enrichment in their environment has an effect on the formation of their brain and the development of their brain, and that not having proper enrichment can harm the formation of your brain. May-Britt Mosier is a Norwegian neuroscientist who worked on the discovery of how your brain and your hippocampus encodes space, and she actually won the Nobel Prize for her work in 2014. And then lastly, I want to talk about Brenda Milner. She was also one of the women who got to study patient HM, and her work was essential to our current understanding of behavior in the brain. She also discovered multiple systems for memory. So if you're not super familiar with memory, there are multiple different ways that memories are formed and encoded, and she was essential to discovering that. The reason why I really wanted to talk about her is because in 2014, she was awarded a Cavalli Award for her research, and I'm just going to put up a picture here of wherever she was awarded that, of the ceremony. She was awarded that along with 15 other people, and if you look at this image, it's 15 other white men. So one woman among 15 men was awarded this in 2014. This was 7 years ago. Like, that's not that long ago. So if anyone's been sitting through this video going, women are properly represented in science, and like there's so many women always talking about how they're underrepresented, but like I see women all the time, so they're totally fine, I think this picture speaks volumes. So I'm sorry to end on such a serious note, but happy Women's History Month. I hope you go out there, learn something new about women. For me, it was extremely empowering to do this research because I don't know about any of you, but I was never taught any of these women's names. In neuroscience, we oftentimes get taught about famous neuroscience researchers, and there's a lot of straight white men that we have to learn about and memorize their names and their discoveries. And I cannot recall ever being taught about a woman who made a discovery. So this was revolutionary because women have always been around and women have always been trying to get into research whether or not men were blocking our path. So to see that women were able to make these amazing discoveries, it's just extremely empowering. As usual, I'll link all my sources in the description. I highly encourage checking them out. There's a lot more details about the history of women in neuroscience that I was not able to touch on because I'm trying to keep my videos shorter. Looking at the amount of time I've been recording for, I don't think I succeeded in that, but we will see. Like I said at the beginning of the video, you can check me out on social medias. I'll list them all here. Make sure you go check out my Instagram, check out my stories. That's where I usually ask questions and do polls and let you guys be involved in what I'm doing. I also sometimes do stories in the lab talking about what it is that I'm doing, so I think that's kind of interesting. Also, if you have any questions that you would like to ask a neuroscientist, you can ask them at this email address, askaneuroresearcher@gmail.com, or just leave it in the comments below. So with all that being said, go have yourself a great Women's History Month, and I will see you next Wednesday. Bye.